I would like to thank everyone on Bamtang's staff for making that intro as awkward and silent as possible. You did it, guys. I'm proud of you. So you may have noticed that we're out of our ranger form again, and I can't remember why this is, but after we defeat a sufficient number of enemies, we will get it back. I guess that's not entirely accurate. How the blue meter fills is when we perform combos, which is consecutive hits of any sort. Like, they don't need to be fancy combos or anything. Like, for example, I got a 30-hit combo there, but that doesn't really matter. Even if you only ever did 3-hit combos, your energy meter would still fill just as quickly as if you got a 30 or 40-hit combo. All that matters is that multiple hits are landing, not with what frequency they land. And after another wave of normal putties, it's time for a new enemy type, the Crystal Knight. The Crystal Knight has 3 attacks that I'm aware of. They can extend their lance straight up in the air to knock you back. They can whip their lance around in a devastating combo, making it impossible to counterattack. And they can summon putties. But they're so vulnerable to being stun-locked that generally you can destroy them as soon as they appear without any issues. Now, the putties guarding this door don't drop any experience, because they will respawn until the door breaks, and they don't want you to be able to grind them for points. And while this is fine in theory, I think you should totally let people grind for points in this game. The upgrades do completely wreck the game balance, it's true, but more people would probably enjoy it if they could wreck the game balance sooner rather than later. That's not to say the game is unenjoyable when it's challenging, it's just for the average person. I think it would be more enjoyable if they could destroy everything much easier. Because the challenge is not what anyone's going to come to this game for. It's true that if you don't know what you're doing, the enemies can get some decent hits in on you and you can actually die, but after you figure out how to deal with everything by using air combos all of the time, then the minimal challenge just becomes memorizing exactly what you need to do for each enemy type, which is not saying a lot. So this level is, I think, the only non-linear level in the game, because you can enter side rooms, which may or may not have interesting stuff in them. Some of them are empty. They also have their own neat ambient music, like this one just has beeps and boops because it's a laptop store, and I imagine that would drive someone insane if they worked here. Generally, stores have some kind of music regardless of how small they are. And it's probably because the torture of just listening to beeps and boops all day would drive someone mad and break them down into tears, and then they would quit and leave the store unattended for hours. But maybe that's just me. So you're no doubt wondering if there's a practical reason to enter these side rooms instead of just to hit more dudes for fun. And indeed there is. You might have noticed down on the lower floor we rescued a hostage. And the goal of this level before we can proceed is to rescue 4 hostages. This is not the only level with this mechanic, but it may as well be, because it's the only one where the mechanic matters. Because of the way this level is structured, you actually have to search, however briefly, for all of the hostages, but in the next level where the hostages appear, they're all right in front of your line of sight, meaning that they might as well not be there. You can break open their containers so quickly that breaking open their containers while enemies attack you is not a challenge. Finding them was the only challenge. These little side rooms in the mall remind me of, I'm trying to remember what beat 'em up it was, a Burning Fight, where there were occasionally side rooms with extra little mini-games where you could break stuff to get money and health and coins. And I think that was just for points, but it was still kinda cool. Now we're in the bathroom, and you'll notice the bathroom is like completely wrecked, presumably by the putties, which is kinda weird. I question why the putties would want to destroy this bathroom in particular, but I don't question how fun it is to hit so many of them at once. In fact, I wish they stood this close together all the time, because that would increase my enjoyment of the game a significant amount. So you might have noticed, if you were paying close attention, that we're still level 1, even though we're on the 2nd world out of 6. And the levels go all the way up to 10. Leveling up does get faster, but if you are playing this game, you might get the impression that the levels go really slowly to the point that the upgrades wouldn't matter. But no, the upgrades matter a lot. And there's the Crystal Warrior using that combo I was talking about. We have to wait until it's done to attack it. But generally it's easy enough to stun lock that we can hit it as soon as it stands back up. Now with all 4 oh hey, we're level 2 finally. Now with all 4 hostages rescued, the magical barrier blocking our way forward is down. A lot of the putties roam around this stage and can be ignored entirely, again adding to its non-linear nature. We can only upgrade ourselves at these stations, and As much as the game will try to convince you that buying attack upgrades and new fancy moves is worth it, all we want right now is health and defense upgrades. When you're making upgrades like this, you have to make the new moves you get look enticing enough to be worth passing up health and defense upgrades, but not only do they not look that enticing, but health and defense upgrades are just so more practical. You don't even need to use any of the extra moves. They don't add enough utility to be worth it. Now, we will eventually buy one extra move that I think is definitely worth the time because it simply increases damage output in a very direct fashion, but you'll know what that is when we get it. You can see a poster of our Megazord battling with something in the background, and that's actually a monster we have yet to see, but we will later in the game. It's unidentifiable right now because it's just a silhouette. Now it's time for an enemy combination that you might actually consider a little bit difficult, the Crystal Warrior with the Black Knight. I generally try to take out the Crystal Warrior first because he's just easier to kill, but not only that, he's capable of summoning putties, which would make the situation even worse. The most challenging thing about this pairing is that the Black Knight will relentlessly pursue you while you're trying to take out the Crystal Warrior. Now make no mistake, the Black Knight definitely has more threatening attacks, and if you wanted to take him out first, that's a perfectly valid strategy because the Crystal Warrior is less threatening in an offensive sense. But the Crystal Warrior's ability to summon putties always extends the fight for an unnecessarily long amount of time, so I just get rid of him first. The putties don't even add all that much challenge, they're just more to keep track of. Anyway, we're now at the end of the stage, and it wasn't so bad, it was even a little bit interesting because of its non-linear nature. Alright, so we're finally here at the fair or carnival or whatever level that I promised way earlier. And upon reflection, that may have not been foreshadowing to this level, but it doesn't matter because it still exists, so I was not technically lying. I enjoy this level because it looks interesting and it has a couple of cute gimmicks in it, but I'm not gonna lie and tell you that I had some sort of strategy for this fight, or most of the fights in this level. As long as you know how to evade the Black Knight and his attacks, which isn't all that complicated, then it doesn't really matter what order you take the enemies out in. The reason the Crystal Warrior and Black Knight combination was mildly challenging was because the Crystal Warrior actually took some doing to get onto the ground. Enough doing that the Black Knight could sneak up on you and attack you in the process. But the normal putties are so weak that you can just take your time and leisurely pick off the enemies in whatever order you want. There's no reason to optimize your strategy at all. Alpha's here in the background again, but we couldn't possibly have leveled up in time to use him, so I assume he's there, just in case you didn't level up in the last level. So here's the most hectic fight in the game yet. A normal putty, the Crystal Warrior, and the Black Knight. It's also one of the more difficult normal putties, so that helps a little bit, but you'll notice that my strategy here is incredibly haphazard. Yeah, I managed to get away from the Black Knight a few times, but I get hit once or twice because I'm not really paying any attention, and very little consequence. Now, if the Black Knight manages to unleash a full combo on you, you might actually be in a decent bit of trouble, but usually health refills are so frequent that it's not all that bad. Enemy layouts this early in the game are easy enough that you should only suffer at most 1 or 2 full combos, and at most your health should go down to half. But even if it does, yeah, there's a ton of healing items all over the place. Right up here there's this weird glowing machine, and you might think it looks interesting, but all we have to do is destroy it. It's just another method to dispel barriers. It's no different than hitting the barrier directly, really. It just looks a little cooler, and you can even hide behind it, so that way enemies won't be able to punch you properly, which is kind of funny and probably not intended. After another completely normal wave of putties, it's time for a new enemy type, the Crow. And the Crow enemies have the distinction of being able to block any of your attacks whenever they feel like it, and their block cannot be broken by using a downward kick, like they can with the Black Knight. Fortunately, as you're seeing, there's a very simple strategy to dealing with Black Crows. And this is the only time that the throw is really necessary for practical purposes. So as you might have gleaned from the scenery, we are now on one of those Tunnel of Love water rides, but for some reason we're on a giant burger billboard, and I can't even begin to fathom how this got in here or why we are on top of it. But what I can fathom is that there is a new hazard for us to play with. We can throw the putties into the water to destroy them instantly. So we're going to be spending most of this section doing exactly that. There are a few enemies we will encounter on this little ride that we cannot throw into the water, but most of them we can. We can even throw the crows into the water because, as was already established, the crows are weak to grapples. We cannot throw the crows nearly as far as the normal putties, but we can still throw them at all, so that works fine. We can also, of course, kick the putties into the water, but throwing them is just a much more direct method. As was already said in the last world, this game doesn't have too many selling points from a game design perspective, so I intend to show off all the hazards whenever I can when they appear. The hazards themselves may seem a little bit underwhelming, but a lot about this game is underwhelming. Not necessarily bad, not awful, but even if you're a huge fan of beat-em-ups like me, there's not that much reason to come here. I mean, yeah, I still enjoy the game because I love beat-em-ups, but I imagine most people who love beat-em-ups want good beat-em-ups, ones that stick in your mind for a while. And this isn't bad, but it's certainly not above okay. And the game does seem to be passing by without much of an impact on anything or anyone. Yeah, the Power Rangers movie is coming out soon, and I imagine the game sold well enough, considering the budget doesn't seem particularly enormous. So we cannot grapple the Crystal Warrior. We just can't do it, but we can knock him into the water anyway by juggling him and then kicking him in there. This is easier said than done, though. Still did it, though. Knocking the Black Knight into the water, on the other hand, is not practical at all, so we're not even going to try to do that. After this Black Knight, there's another one, and then a crow, and that's it for this section. In case you were waiting for the enemy patterns to get difficult, or for them to put more of them on screen, or something to make this difficult in any sense, they don't. This is one of the two big interesting sections of the level, too. You know, the things that people would remember the level for. And it's not all that particularly memorable, much like the game itself. Fortunately for us and all the other players of this game, there is not much of a lull between the two interesting sections. There's just this one wave of enemies, and then we're already there. Honestly, if the whole level were just those two interesting sections, that would probably make it better. You might have noticed that sometimes the crows will inexplicably be stunned after we hit them. I don't know what determines this, because I use the same method to defeat them every time. Maybe it just happens by random chance, and if so, that's a little bit odd, and they probably shouldn't do that. Because it makes people like me confused. Okay, so here's the second interesting section of the level. Note, I did not say good. I did not say fun. Just interesting. So yeah, I have no idea what they were thinking, and I would like to assume I'm doing something wrong here. I've tried approaching this in multiple ways, alright? And I have no idea what they wanted from this section. So if somebody who has also played this game could please tell me what I'm doing wrong, or how to make this not incredibly hilarious and stupid, just let me know, please. Because it really doesn't reflect positively on your product when this is not only terrible, but I call it the most interesting part of the level, because this is the most interesting part of the level. The rest of the level is so intensely mediocre and devoid of interesting game design. Like, if this game had interesting enemy patterns or game design, make no mistake, I would be right there talking about those and how cool they were, and how this is a great example of the genre. But I can't, because it isn't. This game is overwhelmingly average. It is so average that it loops around into being average. That is how average it is. You want me to talk about this fight? I can't really. This fight is not all that different from the fight at the start of the level. I am attacking them very haphazardly, barely paying any attention. If you have even the most basic knowledge of how to avoid the Black Knight, you should survive. To the game's credit, having this number of enemies on the screen is more entertaining than most of the things that happened previously in this level, and it does force you to pay a minimal amount of attention. Like, I wasn't bored during this fight or anything. I'm trying to be nice to the game, you know. I realize it may seem like I really hate it, but I don't. I don't hate it at all. It's reasonably entertaining to play, and I will probably play it again someday. It's just not interesting. But here's finally something new for me to talk about. The hit detection in this section is really goofed up. I assume because of the gradual change in altitude that the game was not meant to handle. Sharp changes in altitude are a lot easier to handle because you just jump up or down. But gradual changes tend to really screw with the hit detection. Now, in spite of me saying this, you'll notice that I managed to avoid running into any of these issues this time, and I didn't want to go out of my way to try and demonstrate them. But we will come back to this level later, so we'll see how that pans out. I am just speaking from previous experience from when I practiced the game. If anything, I'm going out of my way to show the game in its best light, while still trying to be honest about it. Normally this is unlike me. Normally I would break the game in as many ways as possible, as frequently as possible. And there will be so much breaking in the second half of the game, but I want you to have a reasonable idea of how the game design was meant to work before we actually do that. Because otherwise there would be no reason to see the game at all. I suppose by breaking I mean really fucking the game's balance up, but I can't consider it anything other than an oversight. I don't want to believe that the way I play the second half of the game is how it's meant to be played. It's more entertaining that way, but I don't want to believe that's what they wanted. So after we destroy these normal putties, we get the hardest fight in the game so far. Now you can totally die here if you're not paying the minimal amount of attention, I'm not gonna lie. The Black Knight can totally destroy you while you're trying to take out the Crow and the Crystal Warrior, assuming you don't know how to avoid him. And you'll notice that I'm spending a lot of time running away from the Black Knight and trying to avoid him entirely. And the entire challenge of this fight would be circumvented if you just killed the Black Knight first. It would. But I don't, and why? Because again, I'm trying to go out of my way to show this game in its best light. And it looks better to avoid the Black Knight while fighting the other enemies than to kill the Black Knight first and then tromp the other enemies because they're not challenging. Turban Shell here is actually a pretty chill boss. He has a lot of different moves and a lot of different phases that come at you very rapidly, and none of them deal very much damage, but they come so quickly that the fight never has a chance to get stale, and I appreciate that. It's very entertaining and it's very fun. If all the bosses were this rapid fire and had moves this varied, then the game would actually be worth talking about for the boss fights. The boss fights aren't challenging, and this boss fight is no exception, but if they all followed Turban Shell's example, then they would all be pretty good. Not fantastic, not outstanding, but pretty good. For example, you think this time he'll shoot the homing lasers at you again, and you're right, but he also splits into two. Since you were already introduced to the homing lasers, you have no trouble avoiding them in groups. But there's the added difficulty of finding out which one is real and still getting to him in time to hit him. He gives you plenty of time to still hit him, but, you know, the game didn't waste your time. It gave you one attack, and after you knew how to dodge it, it gave you another one. In another game, the attacks coming this quickly might be a problem, because the attacks might be more difficult to avoid, or they might deal more damage, but all of these attacks are easy to avoid, which makes it perfect for this rapid-fire kind of change. And this boss made me think maybe the developers were aware of that. Maybe they were aware of the downfalls of the game being the lack of difficulty and how easy it was to evade the boss's attacks, maybe due to a lack of creativity. And because of that, they increased the pacing of the fights to make it more exciting. and that's actually a really good idea, but this pattern does not continue for any of the future boss fights. Speaking of things that seem deceptively self-aware, this Megazord tank section also seemed deceptively self-aware. You see, some of the weak points are on Turban Shell's elbows, which makes them a lot easier to miss, and in fact, the first time I played this game, I did miss those shots frequently. The way his elbow moves slightly up and down, combined with the precise aiming required to actually hit something with a charge shot, I thought that was an intentional design decision. I thought the weak spots in the tank sections were going to keep being harder to hit, and eventually they would actually require some genuine strategy and time management. But this is the only time something like that ever occurs, so my optimism was quickly destroyed. That being said, this is still the best tank section for the fact alone that some of the weak spots are actually difficult to hit.